The German officers stepped off the transport plane with a mixture of apprehension and grim expectation etched onto their faces. They had been trained, briefed, and conditioned to anticipate nothing but hostility in America. Propaganda had painted a picture of a cold, unwelcoming land, one that would punish enemy soldiers without mercy, a place where fear would stalk them at every corner. Every story, every leaflet, every whispered warning had built a mental fortress of dread around them. They imagined concrete prison cells, armed guards, and glaring eyes that would scrutinize their every movement. The very air, they thought, would be thick with suspicion and animosity, every street a potential trap, every passerby a potential threat. Yet, as their boots touched the tarmac, the reality was startlingly different. The sun shone warmly, the wind carried the scent of freshly cut grass and distant fields, and a curious quiet hung over the airfield. Instead of shouting sentries or barking orders, they were met with measured, almost polite gestures, simple nods of acknowledgement, and a calm efficiency in processing their arrival. It was disorienting in the most profound way. The world they had envisioned as hostile and merciless now appeared orderly, composed, and even faintly welcoming. They glanced at one another, silently questioning if they had arrived in the wrong country. The tension between expectation and reality was immediate and palpable, a friction that tugged at their minds with subtle insistence. Could this be a ruse? A trap set with a smile? Their training demanded suspicion, yet their senses rebelled against the narrative they had carried for months, years even. There was a peculiar dissonance in the juxtaposition, the anticipation of torment clashing with the calm normalcy before them. Every small gesture, the way an officer handed over a clipboard, the faint nod accompanying a polite inquiry, even the careful organization of the transport area, struck them as almost alien. They had been prepared for intimidation and cruelty, not civility. Their minds raced, trying to reconcile this unanticipated reality with everything they had been taught about the Americans. In that quiet tension, a faint seed of wonder took root. What kind of place was this, where the enemy's demeanor seemed more human than feared? It was the first glimpse of a truth that would unravel their assumptions and reshape their perceptions, planting the first question that would haunt their stay. Maybe America was not the hell they had braced themselves for, but something entirely different. Before setting foot on American soil, the German officers had been thoroughly indoctrinated. Months of military briefings, pamphlets, and carefully curated newspaper clippings had painted a vivid, unrelenting picture of the United States. They were told that Americans were not only militarily formidable, but morally corrupt and ruthlessly hostile to their enemies. Stories circulated in letters from frontline comrades who had never been there but had heard tales of brutal interrogation methods, overcrowded prison camps, and harsh punishments for even minor infractions. The officers clutched these accounts like sacred warnings, allowing each story to layer upon the last, reinforcing the notion that fear, vigilance, and strict discipline would be their only shields in the foreign land. Propaganda went beyond military briefings. Illustrations in magazines depicted Americans as grotesque and untrustworthy, often exaggerating their wealth, indulgence, and laziness. Rumors of decadent lifestyles, lavish parties, chaotic cities, and violent streets filled the officers' imaginations, turning the idea of arrival into a psychological gauntlet. Letters from older relatives who had visited America decades prior were twisted into cautionary tales, emphasizing crime, disorder, and the perceived coldness of the people. Even casual conversations among soldiers carried a tone of horror. Every anecdote, whether factual or invented, became another brick in the wall of dread that separated the officers' expectations from reality. They had been trained to see every smile as a potential threat, every polite question as a trap, every gesture of hospitality as a calculated deception. The repetition of such warnings created a mental script they followed without question, anticipating suspicion and cruelty at every turn. Their imaginations were not idle. They actively rehearsed scenarios of harsh interrogations, unsympathetic prison guards, and nights spent in cold, uncomfortable barracks. Each imagined scenario intensified the contrast with the world they were about to enter. Yet, the moment they arrived, the veneer of fear began to crumble. Simple acts, the measured tone of a questioning officer, the careful handling of documents, the quiet efficiency of processing their arrival, seemed almost mundane, yet they carried an unfamiliar grace. There were no threats, no aggressive posturing, no exaggerated displays of power meant to intimidate them. The officers began to notice subtle details: the orderly lines of soldiers awaiting instructions, the methodical approach to logistics, even the restrained but genuine manners of those overseeing their intake. What they had been taught to dread was absent, replaced instead by routine and, in some moments, unexpected courtesy. This contrast struck them deeply. The myths and exaggerations they had internalized, the cruel, decadent, and dangerous America, collided with a reality that was organized, disciplined, and strangely human. With every step through the airfield, with every interaction, the officers' assumptions wavered. Propaganda had taught them to fear and expect the worst, but their senses now suggested a different narrative entirely, one that demanded reconsideration and cautious curiosity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, a seed of doubt began to take root. The America they feared might exist only in stories, not in the calm, tangible world unfolding before them. As the German officers were transported from the airfield to the nearby town, their senses were immediately struck by the orderliness and efficiency of the infrastructure. Streets were clean and well-maintained, lined with modest but sturdy homes and businesses that radiated a sense of stability and purpose. Traffic moved with predictable rhythm, and public spaces were neatly kept, a sharp contrast to the chaotic images their minds had constructed from rumors and propaganda. The officers could not help but notice the absence of the disorder, filth, or violence they had been told to expect. Every building, every sidewalk, every street corner seemed to whisper calm and quiet, not threat or danger. Their first encounters with the townspeople only deepened their astonishment. Workers paused briefly to nod politely, children waved with innocent curiosity, and shopkeepers offered assistance without any hint of suspicion or hostility. There were no sneers, no judgment, no sense of watching enemies with concealed malice. Even the tone of conversation, casual and warm, unsettled them. It carried a friendliness so natural that it almost seemed naive, yet entirely genuine. These small, ordinary acts of civility clashed violently with the officer's mental image of a cold, vindictive America, creating a persistent inner dissonance they could not immediately reconcile. The officer's accommodation further underscored the stark contrast between expectation and reality. Their quarters, while functional and simple, were comfortable beyond anything they had imagined. Fresh linens, clean bathrooms, and orderly arrangements replaced the feared austerity of prison-like accommodations. Meals, prepared with care and offered without ceremony, provided a sense of dignity and humanity that felt foreign in the context of war. Each small comfort, the softness of a chair, the warmth of a well-cooked meal, the quiet order of daily routines, felt almost indulgent, yet they could not deny the relief it brought. Internally, the officers wrestled with a mix of suspicion and awe. Some questioned whether this was an elaborate ruse, a careful deception meant to lull them into complacency. Others found themselves reluctantly admiring the efficiency and care evident in every aspect of life around them. Conversations between officers were hushed but revealing. Their astonishment leaked into every whispered comment, every furtive glance at an American doing something ordinary yet inexplicably courteous. The cognitive dissonance was constant, a subtle tension that underscored every observation, every step they took in the streets, and every interaction they experienced. By the time the convoy reached the town square, a realization began to crystallize. The America they had feared, with all its cruelty and danger, existed largely in stories and warnings. What lay before them was not the hell they had been trained to anticipate, but a land defined by a peculiar blend of civility, comfort, and unexpected kindness. It was a world that demanded reassessment, forcing them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the people and the country they had come to despise and fear. The officers quickly discovered that the most striking aspect of their experience in America was not the infrastructure or routines, but the people themselves. From the moment they stepped into local homes and community spaces, they were met with an unexpected warmth that seemed almost disarming. The first invitation to share a meal came from a small family whose curiosity about the war had outweighed any suspicion. At the dinner table, the officers encountered dishes that were unfamiliar yet thoughtfully prepared, served with a genuine eagerness to accommodate. Simple gestures, a napkin placed carefully, a warm smile, or a casual question about their health, felt revolutionary in contrast to the fear and suspicion they had anticipated. Meals became more than just sustenance. They were a window into a society that prized dignity and civility even in extraordinary circumstances. In one memorable encounter, an elderly woman insisted on serving freshly baked bread, explaining with pride how she had learned the recipe from her mother. The officers were initially hesitant, unsure if such kindness was a test or a trap, but the sincerity was undeniable. Conversation flowed cautiously at first, filled with polite inquiries about family, hometowns, and the war. Slowly, barriers began to dissolve, replaced by genuine curiosity and, in some cases, quiet amusement at cultural differences. Community events further challenged their preconceptions. They were invited to a small-town baseball game, where local residents cheered not for victory over enemies, but for the enjoyment of shared leisure. Children approached shyly, offering handshakes or small trinkets, their innocence bridging a gap the officers had assumed unbridgeable. At town dances and church socials, they witnessed a rhythm of life that was completely foreign yet unmistakably human. They saw people laughing freely, sharing music and food, and treating them not as captives but as temporary guests deserving of respect. These encounters extended beyond simple civility into deliberate acts of hospitality. One family prepared a separate room for the officers in their home, ensuring privacy and comfort. Neighbors stopped to offer small tokens, a jar of preserves, fresh fruit, or a handcrafted ornament, as if to demonstrate that friendliness and curiosity could coexist with the reality of war. The officers began recording these moments mentally, astonished by the willingness of strangers to go out of their way to create normalcy in the midst of conflict. Even small gestures, like a child insisting on reading aloud from a favorite book or a neighbor showing them a well-kept garden, became profound lessons in human decency. Each interaction slowly eroded the mental walls built by years of propaganda. The officers' initial suspicion persisted, a faint echo of old fears, but it was increasingly overshadowed by wonder and gratitude. For the first time, they began to see the possibility that America was not the merciless land they had feared, but a place where ordinary people extended kindness even to those they had been taught to view as enemies. By the end of their first week immersed in these civilian experiences, a quiet transformation had begun. Fear gave way to curiosity, suspicion softened into cautious respect, and the officers could no longer deny the humanity of the people surrounding them. The officers' arrival at the prisoner-of-war camp marked a turning point, where the stark contrast between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. They had braced themselves for something close to imprisonment under cruel and relentless supervision. Barbed wire, armed guards shouting commands, and the cold indifference of men trained to see them as enemies. Instead, the camp presented a measured calm, almost orderly serenity, that defied everything they had anticipated. They were met by officers who treated them with a formal politeness that suggested neither fear nor malice, and the guards, while vigilant, were professional rather than threatening. The initial intake procedures were thorough but conducted with efficiency and dignity, a subtle message that the prisoners' humanity was not to be dismissed. Once settled in their quarters, the officers immediately noticed the quality of their accommodations. Unlike the stark, punitive cells they had imagined, the rooms were clean, well ventilated, and furnished simply but comfortably. Fresh bedding, ample space, and a system of personal storage lent a sense of personal dignity that few of them had anticipated in captivity. Meals were served at regular intervals, and to their continued astonishment, the food was more than adequate. Warm, nutritious, and surprisingly varied. Officers who had anticipated days of thin, tasteless rations now found themselves savoring hearty stews, fresh bread, and occasionally even fruit or desserts. The contrast was bewildering, almost disorienting. Each bite, each sip, a quiet contradiction to the stories they had internalized for months. Beyond sustenance, the camp offered a range of recreational and educational opportunities. Officers were permitted to read, write letters, and even engage in games or sports, fostering a sense of normalcy that was wholly unexpected. Libraries stocked with books in multiple languages allowed them to pursue intellectual curiosity, while occasional lectures and discussions encouraged reflection and learning. Some officers took to sketching or studying music, finding that creative outlets offered a surprising solace from the tension of war. The opportunities to work on projects, whether practical or artistic, gave a sense of purpose and autonomy, starkly contrasting with their imagined existence of passive suffering and relentless supervision. Daily interactions with American staff further reinforced the discrepancy between expectation and reality. Officers observed a careful balance. Rules were enforced with consistency, yet personal dignity was respected. Guard routines were predictable, professional, and non-threatening, creating an environment of order rather than oppression. Even minor courtesies, such as ensuring they had clean linens or answering questions politely, conveyed a subtle humanity that seemed almost revolutionary to men who had been trained to anticipate cruelty. Slowly, disbelief crept in. Conversations among prisoners often turned into quiet reflections. How could such treatment exist for those they had been taught to consider enemies? How could a nation at war maintain this level of decency and structure? The internal dissonance was profound. Officers wrestled with a mix of incredulity, suspicion, and a dawning respect. Every day, the camp's rhythm reinforced the contradiction between reality and expectation. Organized routines replaced arbitrary punishment, intellectual stimulation replaced idle despair, and kindness replaced hostility. Small gestures, a nurse smiling while checking vitals, a fellow officer offering advice on camp procedures, a recreational match organized to foster morale, became symbolic of a larger truth. Gradually, officers began to reconcile the mental dissonance, recognizing that their preconceived notions were rooted in propaganda and fear rather than fact. The camp, in its structured civility, became a lens through which they could observe a side of America they had never imagined. Disciplined, humane, and surprisingly considerate, even toward those deemed enemies. As the officers settled into the rhythms of camp life, they began to notice subtler layers of their American surroundings, elements of culture and daily practice that no briefings or propaganda could have prepared them for. Simple, informal exchanges revealed dimensions of American life that challenged long-held assumptions. Casual conversations with guards and fellow prisoners introduced idiomatic English, local expressions, and humor that were initially difficult to grasp but increasingly illuminating. Officers who had spent years insulated in military routines found themselves learning phrases and words not through textbooks but through laughter, shared stories, and the practicalities of everyday communication. Food, once a simple necessity, became an unexpected conduit for cultural understanding. Meals shared with American staff or at local homes introduced flavors, ingredients, and preparation methods that were entirely new. Cornbread, pies, roasted vegetables, and fresh dairy products provided more than sustenance. They were symbols of domestic routines and culinary pride. Officers began to ask questions, learning the significance of traditional dishes and the ways in which meals reinforced family and community bonds. Small experiments in cooking, trying to replicate a recipe or taste test unusual ingredients, offered both amusement and insight, turning food into an unexpected classroom where cultural norms were experienced rather than read about. Community events continued to offer vivid lessons in American values. Attendance at fairs, local dances, or informal sporting matches exposed officers to a society that prized leisure, teamwork, and mutual respect. Observing the coordination required in a baseball game, the organized chaos of a county fair, or the communal celebration of holidays, officers noticed patterns of social cohesion that defied their expectations. Americans treated one another with a combination of politeness and openness, celebrating individuality while fostering community spirit. These experiences highlighted contrasts with the rigid hierarchies and constant suspicion embedded in military life, revealing a society where collaboration and enjoyment were not weaknesses, but strengths. Music and storytelling offered another layer of insight. Nights around campfires or in local halls, officers listened to Americans singing folk songs, recounting family histories, or performing short sketches. The ease with which strangers could connect through humor or shared narrative was striking. Officers began to recognize values often overlooked in wartime propaganda: pride in labor and craft, respect for education, and an underlying belief in fairness and decency. Each song or story was a small challenge to the stereotypes they had been taught, a reminder that human complexity could not be reduced to enemy caricatures. Even in small, everyday moments, the officers' perceptions shifted. Watching children play freely, seeing neighbors help one another without expectation of reward, or observing a family's pride in maintaining their home and garden, all of it offered lessons in patience, empathy, and social responsibility. These experiences fostered a growing respect and curiosity. Slowly, officers began to internalize a simple truth: the America they feared and despised existed largely in their imagination, while the real country revealed itself through subtle gestures, ordinary routines, and human kindness. Cultural exchange, in its most understated forms, was dismantling prejudice piece by piece, replacing fear with understanding and suspicion with genuine appreciation. Over time, the officers began to perceive the human dimension of those they had been trained to see only as adversaries. Initial interactions with American guards and civilians had been courteous but professional. Gradually, these interactions deepened into genuine, if cautious, personal connections. Simple conversations at the edge of a recreation field or during the distribution of mail evolved into exchanges where guards asked about families, hobbies, or experiences before the war. Officers, initially guarded and wary, found themselves responding with honest details, surprised to discover that curiosity and kindness were reciprocated rather than exploited. Shared stories became a bridge across cultures and nationalities. An American sergeant recounted his childhood growing up in a small Midwestern town, describing holidays, local festivals, and the peculiarities of family traditions. The officers, in turn, spoke of villages and routines in Germany, of homes and communities left behind in a world now torn by conflict. These narratives revealed common hopes and fears, childhood joys, and universal frustrations, highlighting experiences that transcended political allegiance. Each tale, no matter how small, chipped away at the prejudice ingrained by propaganda, replacing suspicion with empathy and understanding. Letters played an equally important role in developing these bonds. Officers were permitted to correspond with family back home, often facilitated with the help of Americans who assisted with translation or ensured timely delivery. At the same time, informal letters between officers and sympathetic guards or civilians became small acts of human connection. One officer described receiving a letter from a guard who had noticed his interest in drawing, enclosing a sketchbook and gentle encouragement. Another recalled a note from a local family thanking him for his efforts in a shared gardening project during recreation hours. Each written exchange reinforced the notion that decency and humanity existed even amidst the machinery of war, that individuals were more complex than the faceless caricatures in their minds. Empathy grew not only through conversation or letters, but also through shared experiences and small acts of mutual support. A guard helping an officer carry supplies, a neighbor providing extra vegetables during a communal meal, or an officer assisting a fellow prisoner with English lessons. Each act, though minor, carried profound significance. The officers began to recognize that Americans were capable of kindness without expectation, that their interactions could be grounded in respect rather than fear or hostility. In these moments, the binary perception of enemy versus ally began to dissolve, replaced by a nuanced understanding of human connection and moral integrity. By the end of these exchanges, officers were quietly transformed. They observed, often with humility, the ways in which ordinary people demonstrated decency and empathy despite the larger conflict surrounding them. What had once seemed unthinkable, that enemies could share laughter, teach lessons, and offer genuine concern, was now part of their daily reality. Prejudice, once a constant companion, was giving way to recognition of the human side of the Americans around them, a slow but irreversible realization that courage and virtue could exist on both sides of the war. As days turned into weeks, the officers found themselves wrestling with a quiet but persistent cognitive dissonance. Every interaction, every observed act of decency, chipped away at the rigid expectations they had carried like armor. They had been trained to see America as a land of cruelty, danger, and moral decay. Yet, the reality before them was consistently humane, orderly, and in many ways surprisingly welcoming. The contradiction between expectation and reality created a mental tension that they could neither ignore nor easily resolve. Moments of humor became unexpected markers of this adjustment. During recreational activities, a minor miscommunication in English or a clumsy attempt to mimic an American idiom would trigger laughter, first awkward, then genuine, bridging gaps of language and nationality. Officers found themselves sharing jokes with guards or civilians, discovering a common humanity in laughter that transcended ideology. Each chuckle, each shared smile, further eroded the fear and suspicion that had once dominated their perceptions. Even small mistakes, like mispronouncing the name of a dish or misreading instructions for a game, became opportunities for connection rather than punishment, subtly reinforcing the reality that this was not a land intent on inflicting suffering. Astonishment accompanied their humor, often leaving officers quietly reflective at the end of each day. They marveled at the meticulous organization of daily routines, the genuine politeness in interactions, and the seemingly effortless balance of authority and courtesy displayed by the Americans around them. Simple acts, a guard ensuring they had clean linens, a neighbor offering a hand with chores, a community member engaging them in polite conversation, became symbols of an unexpected social order rooted in respect rather than intimidation. Each observation challenged the narrative of cruelty and danger, forcing the officers to reassess the assumptions that had long guided their expectations. Conversations among officers revealed the slow, collective process of adaptation. Whispered debates in the evenings reflected a mix of disbelief and admiration. How could a nation at war maintain such civility? Was this simply the exception rather than the rule, or was their entire understanding of America fundamentally flawed? In these moments, the officers recognized that their previous worldview had been shaped as much by fear and propaganda as by fact. The realization was both disconcerting and liberating. Disconcerting because it undermined deeply ingrained beliefs, liberating because it revealed a reality far more complex, humane, and capable of decency than they had ever imagined. By the close of their first month, the officers' perceptions had begun a subtle but profound shift. America was no longer a symbol of threat and terror, but a place defined by order, kindness, and unexpected hospitality. Cognitive dissonance persisted, but it was now accompanied by curiosity, appreciation, and a tentative sense of respect. The land they had feared as hell was, in fact, a nuanced, human environment, challenging every expectation and quietly reshaping their understanding of what it meant to be an enemy in a world still torn by war. As the officers continued to navigate life in America, they increasingly found themselves reflecting on the stark contrast between what they had been taught and what they were actually experiencing. Propaganda, once a distant concept validated by repetition and authority, now seemed almost surreal in its exaggeration. They had been warned repeatedly that Americans were cruel, decadent, and merciless, that they would be treated with suspicion, hostility, and constant vigilance. Yet the reality they confronted each day, a balance of order, courtesy, and small acts of kindness, rendered those warnings hollow, almost absurd. Diary entries reveal the depth of their internal struggle. One officer noted, "Every act of civility feels like a betrayal of the stories I carried in my mind. I expected hostility, yet I find concern and quiet respect instead. How could this be the enemy we were told to fear?" Another wrote of shared laughter with a guard during a game of cards. "I cannot reconcile the friendliness I see with the image of merciless Americans drilled into me. It feels as though I am learning another world entirely, one I never imagined existed." Such reflections under the cognitive dissonance that dominated their thoughts, revealing a slow but persistent dismantling of ingrained prejudice. The psychological impact was profound. Officers began to recognize how fear and propaganda had shaped not only their expectations but also their emotional responses, heightening anxiety, reinforcing suspicion, and even fostering resentment before they had experienced the country firsthand. Encounters with ordinary Americans, neighbors, families, guards, exposed the gap between story and reality, forcing them to confront the humanity of those they had been taught to dehumanize. Each polite greeting, shared joke, or act of consideration became evidence that contradicted the black-and-white worldview they had inherited, demanding introspection and, eventually, adaptation. These moments of realization were often accompanied by both humility and quiet awe. Officers observed that propaganda, while effective in shaping initial impressions, could not withstand the weight of lived experience. One officer admitted in a private reflection, "I had believed that fear and hostility defined this land, but I see now that it is kindness, discipline, and order that persist even in war. Perhaps we were the ones who misunderstood the world." The recognition was unsettling yet enlightening, a reminder of the malleability of perception and the resilience of truth when confronted directly. By juxtaposing the narratives of propaganda with the tangible reality of their daily lives, the officers began to reconstruct their understanding of America. Fear, once instinctive, was replaced with curiosity. Suspicion, once automatic, gave way to empathy, and prejudice, once rigid, softened into a recognition of shared humanity. In examining the disparity between myth and experience, they not only reassessed the country before them, but also came to understand the profound power of personal experience in reshaping worldview, an understanding that would linger long after their time in captivity. When the time came for repatriation, the officers carried with them far more than their uniforms and personal belongings. They bore memories, impressions, and insights that would forever alter the way they perceived America, and, by extension, the world they had once believed to be rigidly defined by fear and enmity. As they boarded transport planes or trains bound for Germany, a mixture of relief and lingering astonishment accompanied them. They left not with resentment or hardened distrust, but with a complex blend of admiration, surprise, and reflection that colored their anticipation of returning home. In Germany, sharing their experiences proved both challenging and revelatory. Letters, conversations with family, and discussions with fellow officers became platforms for recounting the unexpected humanity they had witnessed. They described orderly towns, clean streets, and polite, welcoming civilians. They spoke of generous families who had invited them to share meals, of guards who treated them with fairness, and of small towns that functioned with a sense of calm and civility that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. These stories were often met with incredulity. Friends and comrades struggled to reconcile the officers' accounts with the fearful depictions embedded in wartime narratives. Yet the officers persisted, recognizing that their testimony represented not defiance, but truth, a truth that challenged stereotypes and demanded reconsideration. The personal impact of these experiences extended beyond storytelling. Officers reflected on the ways in which the exposure to American culture and values had reshaped their own beliefs and attitudes. Prejudices that once felt unassailable had softened, replaced by respect for the civility, discipline, and kindness they had observed firsthand. Many acknowledged that laughter shared with strangers, the dignity afforded to prisoners, and the quiet generosity of ordinary Americans had left an indelible mark, fostering a sense of empathy and nuanced understanding that would endure long after the war. Even years later, these memories served as benchmarks against which they measured other nations, conflicts, and human interactions. Some officers recorded in diaries that the experiences challenged more than their assumptions about America. They prompted reflection on their own actions, values, and the broader morality of war. They realized that propaganda, while effective in shaping beliefs, could never fully erase the impact of lived experience. The Americans they had feared were not monsters, but human beings, capable of kindness, integrity, and humor. Returning home, the officers carried the dual burden and privilege of memory, the memory of a country that had defied expectation, and the knowledge that their worldview, once narrow and rigid, had been irrevocably expanded. In this way, the officers' journey did not end at the camp gates or on the transport home. It continued in conversation, reflection, and the subtle recalibration of values, leaving a lasting impression that would influence not only their understanding of America, but also the way they engaged with the world long after the war had ended. As the narrative of the officers' journey reaches its conclusion, the transformation that unfolded over months in America becomes vividly clear. What began as an experience steeped in fear, suspicion, and rigid expectation evolved into a profound understanding of human decency and resilience. Each step, from arrival at the airfield, through encounters with civilians and guards, to the structured routines of camp life, served to dismantle the walls built by propaganda. Fear, once instinctive, gave way to curiosity. Hostility, once automatic, softened into respect and appreciation. The officer's story is not simply one of captivity, but of revelation, illustrating how lived experience can quietly yet powerfully subvert long-held assumptions. The subtle, cumulative impact of small gestures emerges as a central theme. A shared meal, a polite greeting, a moment of humor, or an act of assistance. The seemingly ordinary interactions were the instruments of transformation. These moments revealed that even amid the machinery of war, human kindness could prevail. The officers came to recognize that courage and decency are not the exclusive property of one side. They exist everywhere, waiting to be seen and acknowledged. The juxtaposition between expectation and reality created a tension that, over time, yielded insight, empathy, and a recalibrated moral compass. There is a poignancy in the officers' reflections, a quiet acknowledgement that the world they had imagined, America as a relentless, merciless adversary, was a fabrication of fear and propaganda. Diary entries and whispered conversations reveal astonishment at the civility, discipline, and warmth they encountered. Some officers admitted to a lingering disbelief, a sense that such decency was almost unreal in a wartime context. Yet the truth was undeniable. People who had been trained to see them as enemies had extended generosity, fairness, and understanding. This realization carried not only personal significance but also moral weight, illustrating the capacity of human beings to transcend ideology, conflict, and preconception. The final impression is one of quiet wonder and enduring lesson. Fear had been transformed into appreciation, suspicion into respect, and hostility into understanding. The officer's journey demonstrates that war, while brutal and dehumanizing in so many ways, cannot erase the fundamental human impulse toward kindness and empathy. Even in the darkest contexts, individuals can extend dignity, curiosity, and generosity, quietly reshaping the hearts and minds of those who encounter it. Their story serves as both a testament to the resilience of humanity and a reminder that true understanding often lies not in expectation or doctrine, but in the subtle, transformative power of lived experience.